In the military, respect is never given freely. It is measured in silence, pressure, and the weight of every decision made under authority. At Fort Redstone in Nevada, the morning sun stretched across the concrete training yard, casting long shadows between rows of stationed vehicles and disciplined formations. Captain Emily Carter stood near the edge of the command platform, her posture steady, her expression unreadable, as if she had learned long ago that reacting too quickly was a form of weakness. Around her, soldiers moved with routine precision, yet there was an undercurrent in the air today, something subtle but deliberate, as if the usual order of things had been quietly disturbed. Major William Harlow stepped forward onto the platform, his boots striking the metal stairs with slow, controlled authority, drawing attention without needing to raise his voice. He was a man accustomed to being obeyed, and he made no effort to hide it. His gaze settled on Emily with the kind of detached assessment that suggested he had already made up his mind about her place in the hierarchy. "Captain Carter," he said, loud enough for nearby personnel to hear. "Step forward." Emily complied without hesitation, moving into the center of the platform where every eye within range could see her. The silence tightened slightly as soldiers paused their tasks, sensing the shift in tone. Harlow circled her once, his hands clasped behind his back, studying her as though evaluating equipment rather than a fellow officer. Then, without changing expression, he spoke again, his voice carrying a sharp edge of authority that cut through the morning calm. "You've been assigned here temporarily, but let's be clear about expectations. Discipline is not theoretical in this unit. It is demonstrated." A few faint smirks appeared among the nearby personnel, quickly suppressed but not unnoticed. Emily did not respond. She simply maintained eye contact for a brief moment before lowering her gaze slightly, as if acknowledging instruction rather than challenge. Harlow gestured toward a nearby rack, where polished boots belonging to senior officers were lined in strict order. The implication was immediate, though unspoken for a second longer than necessary, as if he intended for everyone present to feel the weight of the moment. "Clean them," he said finally, his tone steady, almost instructional, as though assigning a routine task in training. The words landed across the yard, carried by the still air, and for a brief instant, even the background noise of the base seemed to soften. Emily did not move immediately. She looked at the boots, then at the formation of soldiers watching from a distance, and finally back at Harlow. Her expression remained calm, composed in a way that made it impossible to read agreement or defiance. It was not hesitation, but calculation. Around them, a few soldiers exchanged brief glances, uncertain whether what they were witnessing was standard procedure or something else entirely. The morning breeze passed through the yard again, lifting dust lightly across the concrete, as if the base itself was waiting for the next instruction to define what kind of day this would become. The silence that followed settled over the training yard like a pressure that no one dared to name directly. Captain Emily Carter remained still for a moment longer, her gaze lowered toward the polished boots placed in front of her, reflecting the morning light with an almost exaggerated sense of order. Around her, soldiers shifted subtly in place, their attention divided between routine duties and the unfolding exchange that had disrupted the usual rhythm of the base. Major William Harlow stood a few feet away, his posture unchanged, his expression composed with the kind of certainty that came from years of command experience. He was not a man who expected hesitation, and he interpreted silence as compliance rather than uncertainty. A nearby lieutenant exchanged a quick glance with another soldier, both of them careful not to let their reactions linger too long. Emily finally moved, not quickly, not slowly, but with deliberate control, stepping closer to the rack where the boots were aligned. She lowered herself slightly, her movements precise, as though following a procedure rather than responding to a request. There was no visible frustration, no visible resistance, only an unsettling calm that made it difficult for anyone watching to determine what she was thinking. One of the junior soldiers leaned slightly toward another and whispered something under his breath, but the words were lost beneath the ambient noise of the base. Harlow observed her closely, expecting perhaps reluctance or hesitation that would need correction, yet what he saw instead was something he could not immediately categorize. Emily adjusted her position and briefly examined the boots again, her focus not on the task itself, but on something beyond it, something subtle in the environment that most others seemed to ignore. The wind moved across the open yard, carrying distant engine sounds from the flight line, and somewhere beyond the perimeter fence, a set of tires rolled over gravel with increasing proximity. A communications officer near the command station checked his radio once, then a second time, his posture tightening slightly as he listened to a transmission that had not been expected at this hour. Emily remained focused downward, but her awareness had clearly shifted, as if she had registered the same change in the atmosphere without acknowledging it outwardly. Harlow stepped a fraction closer, his voice lowering slightly, but still firm. "Do not mistake this for anything other than instruction, Captain," he said, reinforcing the structure of authority that defined the moment. Emily did not respond verbally. Instead, she placed one hand near the edge of the rack, steadying herself briefly, then paused again. It was not defiance, nor acceptance, but something in between that unsettled the simplicity of the situation. A faint tension began to spread among the observing personnel, subtle enough that it would not be spoken aloud but present in the way shoulders straightened and conversation stopped entirely. The distant engine sound grew slightly louder, no longer background noise but approaching presence, and a few heads turned almost instinctively toward the base entrance. A guard near the outer checkpoint adjusted his stance and reached for his radio, speaking quietly into it with increased urgency. Emily finally lifted her gaze just enough to scan the perimeter beyond the training yard, her expression unchanged but her attention fully engaged elsewhere. Harlow noticed the shift and followed her line of sight briefly, though he did not yet understand what had changed in the environment that would warrant such attention. The base, which moments earlier had been defined by routine discipline and controlled authority, now carried an underlying sense that something outside the immediate chain of command was approaching, something that would not be ignored or delayed. Emily straightened slightly, not breaking protocol, but subtly repositioning herself as if preparing for a transition that had not yet been announced. The soldiers around her became quieter still, their attention no longer focused on the interaction at hand, but on the growing certainty that whatever was coming next would alter the meaning of the moment entirely. The growing sound of approaching engines became more defined as it moved across the perimeter of Fort Redstone, no longer an indistinct background presence, but a structured arrival that carried weight and intention. Within the training yard, several soldiers had now fully stopped what they were doing, their attention drawn away from routine discipline and redirected toward the main gate. Captain Emily Carter remained in place, her posture unchanged, but her awareness clearly elevated, as if she had already accounted for this development before anyone else had fully recognized it. Major William Harlow, still standing a short distance from her, finally shifted his stance slightly, his eyes narrowing as he attempted to interpret the shift in atmosphere that was spreading through his unit. A communications officer near the central command table spoke quietly into his radio again, this time with a more urgent tone, confirming an incoming convoy that had not been listed on the morning schedule. The guard at the outer checkpoint raised his hand to signal confirmation, and the main gate began to open in a slow, controlled motion. Dust rose faintly from the movement of vehicles outside the fence line, drifting across the early sunlight in a way that made the entire scene feel momentarily suspended between expectation and realization. Emily turned her head slightly toward the gate, her expression still calm, but now fully attentive, as though recognizing a protocol unfolding that others had not yet identified. Harlow followed her gaze again, this time more deliberately, and for the first time a subtle uncertainty appeared in his expression, though he quickly suppressed it. The sound of boots on concrete began to echo faintly from beyond the entrance, measured and synchronized, not rushed, not disorganized, but disciplined in a way that immediately distinguished it from ordinary movement on base. A junior officer near the edge of the formation straightened instinctively, without being instructed, followed by another, as if responding to an unspoken signal embedded in the rhythm of the approaching formation. Emily shifted her weight slightly, not stepping away, not stepping forward, but adjusting her stance in a way that suggested readiness rather than reaction. The gates finally opened wide enough to reveal the first figures entering Fort Redstone, and what followed was not a casual arrival, but a structured deployment of personnel whose formation reflected a level of discipline that demanded immediate attention. Rows of elite Marines began to appear, moving in coordinated lines that filled the entrance corridor with controlled precision. Their presence was immediate and unmistakable, and within seconds the entire training yard had changed its focus from internal discipline to external recognition. Conversations stopped completely. Even the distant mechanical sounds of the base seemed to fade under the weight of what was unfolding. One by one, the Marines took position within the yard perimeter, aligning themselves in a formation that extended across the open space with deliberate organization. At the front of the formation, a senior officer stepped forward, pausing briefly as his eyes scanned the area until they settled on a single point within the center of the yard. Emily Carter. The moment that recognition occurred, the atmosphere shifted again, sharper this time, as if an invisible structure had locked into place across the entire base. Without verbal command, the Marines began to adjust their posture simultaneously, feet aligning, shoulders squared, hands positioned with perfect uniformity. Then, in a single coordinated action, the entire formation came to attention. The sound of synchronized movement echoed briefly, then faded into complete silence. Every Marine stood facing forward, their attention directed toward Emily Carter. Major Harlow did not move at first. His expression remained fixed, but the rigidity in his posture began to break in subtle increments as he processed what he was seeing. A staff sergeant near him lowered his gaze slightly, as if uncertain whether he was witnessing a formal protocol or an event that had surpassed his understanding of rank structure. Emily did not react immediately. She simply stood in place, now framed by the full presence of the assembled force, her position no longer isolated but defined by recognition at scale. The entire training yard had transitioned from a controlled environment of instruction to a structured moment of acknowledgment, and within that silence, the authority of the situation had shifted in a way that no spoken order could reverse. The silence that followed the synchronized formation settling into attention was unlike the ordinary quiet of a military base. It was dense, structured, and heavy with recognition that had not yet been explained to those standing inside the training yard of Fort Redstone. Every Marine in the formation remained perfectly still, eyes forward, posture locked, as if responding to a command that existed beyond spoken language. Captain Emily Carter stood at the center of their collective focus, unchanged in appearance, but now framed by a level of acknowledgment that contrasted sharply with the moments that had preceded it. Major William Harlow remained near the command platform, his expression still controlled, but the subtle tension in his stance had begun to surface in a way that those closest to him could detect. A faint sound of movement came from the far side of the yard as additional personnel adjusted their positions to accommodate the unexpected arrival, though no one yet spoke. The senior Marine officer at the front of the formation maintained his position, his gaze fixed forward for a brief moment longer before shifting slightly toward Emily, as if confirming alignment with a standing protocol that required absolute certainty before acknowledgement. Emily did not move immediately. Instead, she observed the formation with measured attention, her eyes scanning the disciplined arrangement of personnel with the familiarity of someone who understood its structure on a level beyond observation. The wind moved lightly across the open base, carrying with it the distant hum of aircraft engines from the flight line, but even those sounds seemed secondary to the stillness that had formed at the center of the yard. Harlow finally took a step forward, breaking the rigid stillness of his position, though not yet crossing into the space occupied by the formation. His voice, when it came, was lower than before, controlled but now lacking the earlier certainty. "Explain this," he said, not addressing anyone in particular at first, but clearly expecting an answer from the presence that had just redefined the environment. The senior Marine officer responded without turning fully, his posture still locked in attention. "Protocol acknowledgement has been confirmed," he stated, his tone calm and precise, as if referencing an established order that required no further justification. A second officer stepped slightly into view behind him, holding a secure communication tablet that displayed authorization codes and classification indicators that were not typically visible at this level of command. The display remained angled away from most of the surrounding personnel, but its presence alone was enough to draw attention from those who understood its significance. Emily finally turned her head slightly toward Harlow, her expression unchanged but now carrying a quiet clarity that contrasted with the confusion forming around her. She did not speak immediately. Instead, she took one measured step forward, not toward Harlow, but into a position that aligned her more directly with the center of the formation. The Marines remained at attention, their discipline unwavering, while the tension in the yard shifted from uncertainty to structured anticipation. Harlow watched closely, his earlier confidence now replaced by a restrained focus that suggested he was beginning to reassess the situation in real time. Around them, the base personnel who had been observing from the perimeter remained silent, their attention fixed on the interaction that was no longer simply a disciplinary exchange, but something far more formal in nature. Emily's presence now carried a weight that extended beyond rank visibility, and the environment itself seemed to adjust to accommodate it. The senior Marine officer raised his hand briefly, signaling a confirmation gesture that was mirrored across the formation in near-perfect unison. No words were spoken, yet the meaning was clear within the structure of military protocol being executed. Harlow's gaze moved between Emily and the formation, searching for an anchor point that would restore the familiar hierarchy he was accustomed to enforcing, but nothing in the scene aligned with that expectation anymore. The air remained still, and the training yard, once defined by instruction and command, now functioned under a different form of recognition that had already taken effect. The tension inside Fort Redstone did not ease as the formation of elite Marines remained locked in perfect attention, their presence reinforcing a level of authority that had now overtaken the training yard entirely. Captain Emily Carter stood at the center of it all, her posture unchanged, but the environment around her had shifted into something far more formal than anything Major William Harlow had anticipated when the morning began. The communication officer near the command table held his radio closer now, listening with increased focus as additional confirmation channels activated across secure lines. A quiet acknowledgment passed through his headset, and his expression tightened slightly as he processed what was being relayed. Harlow noticed the change and stepped closer to the command area, his voice measured but no longer carrying the same unquestioned authority. "I want a full explanation of what protocol this is," he said, directing his attention toward the senior Marine officer who had led the formation into the yard. The officer did not respond immediately, maintaining his position at attention for a brief moment longer, as if awaiting a formal signal before speaking. Around them, the Marines remained perfectly still, their discipline uninterrupted, creating a visual boundary that separated Emily from everyone else present. Finally, the officer spoke in a controlled and precise tone. "Authorization has been confirmed through Joint Operations Command Clearance Level 7, he stated, his words carrying a weight that immediately altered the perception of everyone within earshot. The phrase alone caused a shift in posture among several officers nearby, as they exchanged brief looks that suggested they understood the significance of such classification even if they had not expected it to be activated at Fort Redstone. Harlow paused, his expression tightening slightly as he processed the implication, but he did not respond immediately. Emily remained still, her gaze now directed toward the formation rather than any single individual, as if acknowledging the structure that had been placed around her without needing to validate it verbally. The communication officer raised his radio again, listening to a second transmission that arrived through a secure military channel. His voice, when he spoke, was quieter than before but deliberate. "Incoming command verification," he said, turning slightly toward Harlow. "Direct confirmation from Central Authority is en route." A faint shift moved through the yard as personnel adjusted their attention again, this time toward the far end of the base where a secondary access road led toward the command headquarters. In the distance, the sound of another vehicle convoy became audible, slower and more deliberate than the earlier arrival, accompanied by the distinct tone of official escort presence. The Marines in formation did not move, but their alignment remained exact, reinforcing the sense that they were awaiting a final procedural acknowledgment rather than a situational change. Emily finally took another step forward, not toward Harlow, but into a position that aligned her more clearly with the center of the structured formation around her. Her movement was subtle, yet it reinforced her role within the scene in a way that required no verbal explanation. Harlow observed this carefully, his earlier assumptions continuing to erode as the situation developed in a direction that was no longer under his operational control. The distant convoy grew closer, and the sound of engines slowed as they approached the inner perimeter of Fort Redstone. A final signal came through the communication line, and the officer holding the secure tablet adjusted its angle, revealing a confirmation sequence that activated across multiple verification layers. The yard, once defined by training and instruction, now operated under a different level of command recognition that had fully replaced its previous structure without interruption. Emily remained at the center of it, composed and still, as the entire base waited for the next acknowledgment that would define her position beyond any doubt. The distant convoy slowed to a controlled halt near the inner perimeter of Fort Redstone, and the subtle vibration of engines across the tarmac added a new layer of awareness to the yard. Captain Emily Carter adjusted her stance slightly, her gaze sweeping across the disciplined line of Marines without breaking the composure that had marked every movement she had made since stepping onto the platform. Major William Harlow watched carefully, his earlier certainty replaced by measured observation, his mind recalibrating to the evolving circumstances that were now clearly beyond the standard scope of authority he had anticipated. The senior Marine officer at the front of the formation remained perfectly aligned, his hand raised briefly in a gesture that carried precise meaning, signaling the continuation of a recognition protocol that required attention from every member of the formation. Personnel near the command station exchanged subtle glances, acknowledging the unfolding sequence without disrupting the disciplined silence that dominated the yard. Emily's eyes, steady and observant, took in the details of the approaching vehicles and the pattern of movements among the additional troops now converging from the secondary access point. Her attention was deliberate, not reactive, indicating a familiarity with structured operations that surpassed most present in the yard. Harlow took another cautious step closer, speaking with a controlled, quieter tone. "Status report," he said, directing his attention toward the officer holding the secure tablet, while simultaneously observing the formation that now defined the center of authority in the yard. The officer responded smoothly, his words clear and precise. "Command verification confirmed. Clearance level 7 acknowledged. All personnel are executing standard acknowledgment procedure." The subtle shift in tone carried weight, as those standing nearby immediately recognized the distinction of level 7 clearance and understood its implications without further explanation. Emily shifted her weight slightly, aligning herself more centrally with the assembled formation while maintaining a neutral expression, conveying authority through presence alone. The entire yard seemed to recalibrate around her position as additional signals passed through the communication channels, confirming the procedural correctness of the ongoing acknowledgment. Soldiers at the edges of the formation adjusted their stances ever so slightly, mirroring the precision and alignment that the leading officer had established. Harlow's posture tightened slightly as he absorbed the visual and procedural cues, realizing that the structure of command had shifted in a way that required acknowledgment beyond personal authority. A secondary team of communications personnel stepped forward, ensuring that all channels were actively monitored for additional confirmations, their movements precise but unobtrusive, adding to the seamless execution of protocol. The convoy personnel at the perimeter now disembarked with synchronized efficiency, merging subtly into the broader alignment without interrupting the central focus on Emily. She remained calm, her composure unbroken, allowing the disciplined execution around her to convey authority without a single word from her mouth. Harlow's eyes moved from Emily to the senior officer and back again, trying to reconcile the traditional hierarchy with the newly visible structure, recognizing that the formation's acknowledgment of her presence carried a legitimacy that no individual assertion could override. The wind shifted slightly across the base, lifting faint dust from the tarmac, but not disturbing the precise arrangement of personnel. Emily's gaze continued to sweep the yard, registering every micro-adjustment, every minor shift in posture among the Marines, all part of a larger orchestration that reinforced the formal acknowledgment of her position. The entire environment seemed to hold, poised in anticipation, with every element from communication devices to disciplined personnel converging in a moment of quiet yet undeniable recognition, solidifying her authority in the space without the need for spoken confirmation. The atmosphere inside Fort Redstone had fully transitioned into a state of formal recognition, where every movement, every sound, and every line of sight was now influenced by the structured presence of elite Marines and the converging command personnel. Captain Emily Carter remained at the center of this controlled environment, her posture steady and her expression unchanged, yet her position had become the focal point of every system now active across the base. Major William Harlow stood several feet away, his attention divided between the senior Marine officer and the unfolding coordination at the perimeter, where additional command vehicles had fully entered the secured zone and come to a precise halt. The doors of the lead vehicle opened, and a senior flag officer stepped out with measured composure, immediately surveying the formation before him. No one spoke. The silence that followed was not accidental but procedural, a continuation of protocol that demanded structured acknowledgment before verbal communication could occur. The senior Marine officer at the front of the formation subtly adjusted his stance, signaling readiness for direct confirmation. Emily's gaze remained forward, but her awareness clearly registered the arrival of the flag officer, her attention aligning with the shift in command presence without any visible reaction. Harlow took a step forward, then paused as the flag officer raised a hand slightly, indicating that no interruption was required at that moment. The flag officer walked slowly toward the center of the yard, each step deliberate, reinforcing the formality of the situation. As he approached, the Marines maintained absolute attention, their alignment unbroken, their discipline reinforcing the authority structure that now defined the entire base environment. The flag officer stopped several feet from Emily, his eyes meeting hers briefly before shifting to the formation surrounding her. He spoke in a calm, controlled tone that carried across the silent yard. "Proceed with final confirmation," he stated. The senior Marine officer responded immediately. "Final acknowledgment protocol active. Clearance validation complete." The words carried through the yard with absolute clarity, and the impact was immediate among those who understood the classification level being referenced. Harlow's expression tightened slightly as he processed the confirmation, realizing that the procedural language being used was not administrative but operational at the highest level of command authorization. Emily remained composed, her stance unchanged, but her position now fully integrated into the structured recognition being formally executed around her. The flag officer took one step closer, studying her briefly before addressing the formation directly. "All units will maintain current alignment until full transfer of command acknowledgement is completed," he said, his voice steady and authoritative. Without hesitation, the Marines maintained their position, their synchronization reinforcing the finality of the directive. A communications specialist near the command table confirmed the transfer sequence through secure channels, his eyes scanning multiple authentication layers displayed on a secured interface. The yard, once defined by training activity and internal command structure, had now fully transitioned into a controlled acknowledgement environment governed by external authority verification. Emily's presence remained the anchor point of this configuration, her position recognized not through declaration but through the coordinated response of every system present. Harlow, now visibly restrained in his movements, observed the exchange without interruption, his earlier assumptions fully replaced by procedural reality. The flag officer finally turned his attention back to Emily, maintaining a brief pause before speaking again. "Your status has been confirmed across all operational channels," he said. The statement was not questioned, not elaborated, and not challenged by any remaining presence in the yard. The recognition was complete, and the environment reflected that completion in its absolute silence and structured stillness. The flag officer remained still for a brief moment after confirming the full operational status across all channels, his attention fixed on Captain Emily Carter as if aligning final internal verification with the physical reality in front of him. The yard at Fort Redstone stayed silent, not from uncertainty anymore, but from the completion of a structured recognition process that had removed ambiguity from every level of command present. Major William Harlow stood at a measured distance, his posture now fully restrained, his earlier authority replaced by careful observation as he processed the finality of what had been confirmed. The Marines remained at attention without deviation, their formation unchanged, reinforcing the sense that what was unfolding was not an interruption but an authorized transition. Emily did not move immediately. Instead, she maintained her position at the center of the formation, her expression steady, her focus directed forward as if awaiting the final procedural acknowledgment that would close the loop of confirmation. The flag officer took a step closer, then stopped at a respectful distance, his voice calm and precise as he addressed her directly. "All operational commands under this jurisdiction recognize your authority status," he said. The statement carried across the yard clearly, leaving no space for interpretation or doubt. A communications specialist at the command station confirmed the statement through encrypted channels, his screen displaying synchronized validation across multiple command networks. The yard seemed to settle further into silence, as though the environment itself had adapted to the completion of protocol. Harlow exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering slightly as the weight of the confirmation settled into the structure he had previously controlled. He no longer spoke, understanding that any attempt to intervene would not alter the established hierarchy that had now been formally activated. Emily finally shifted her stance, turning slightly toward the flag officer, acknowledging the formal recognition with a controlled nod that carried procedural significance rather than personal expression. The senior Marine officer at the front of the formation responded immediately, signaling a unified adjustment across the entire unit. In perfect synchronization, the Marines transitioned from attention to a formal acknowledgment stance, maintaining discipline while reflecting the completed status of command recognition. The movement was precise, minimal, and executed without hesitation, reinforcing the structured nature of the moment. Around the perimeter, additional personnel who had arrived earlier maintained their positions, their focus now fully directed toward the center of the yard where Emily stood as the recognized authority within the current operational framework. The flag officer stepped slightly aside, indicating that the formal acknowledgment phase had been completed. "Protocol transfer is now effective," he stated calmly. The words were not dramatic, but definitive, marking the conclusion of a sequence that had progressed through multiple levels of verification and command validation. Emily remained composed, her presence steady, as the formation around her held its structure. The entire base, from the perimeter checkpoints to the central command station, now reflected a unified acknowledgment state that extended beyond individual interpretation. Harlow remained silent, his earlier assumptions fully replaced by the procedural reality that had unfolded in front of him, leaving no ambiguity in the chain of authority that now governed the environment. The Marines continued to hold formation, awaiting further instruction under the newly confirmed command structure, while the flag officer maintained his position just outside the central alignment, signaling that the transition was complete. Emily stood at the center of it all, not through assertion, but through formal recognition that had been verified across every required level, establishing her position within Fort Redstone as the defining authority of the moment. The final phase of recognition at Fort Redstone settled into a controlled stillness, the kind that follows the completion of a high-level command transition where every participant understands that no further clarification is required. Captain Emily Carter remained at the center of the formation, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if the weight of multiple verification layers had simply become part of the environment rather than something that demanded reaction. The flag officer stood slightly to the side now, no longer initiating commands, but overseeing the final stabilization of the protocol state that had just been confirmed across all operational channels. Major William Harlow remained silent, his hands behind his back, his gaze lowered intermittently as he processed the full scope of what had taken place within a matter of minutes that had permanently altered the command structure of Fort Redstone. Around them, the elite Marines maintained their disciplined formation, no longer in transition, but fully stabilized under the acknowledged chain of authority that now centered on Emily. A communications specialist confirmed once more through encrypted systems that all external and internal command networks had synchronized to reflect the completed transfer status. The yard itself felt different, not physically changed, but structurally redefined by the absence of ambiguity. Emily finally turned her attention slightly toward the flag officer, her movement precise and minimal, acknowledging the completion of protocol without breaking the formal tone that governed the moment. The flag officer responded with a brief nod, signaling that no further administrative steps were required at this level of execution. A moment of quiet passed through the formation, not as hesitation, but as procedural closure. One by one, the Marines maintained their positions, awaiting secondary instruction that would determine their next operational assignment under the updated command hierarchy. Emily took a slow step forward, not toward any individual, but toward the center line of the yard, reinforcing her position within the structure that had now been formally established. Her presence remained steady, not amplified by reaction, but defined by recognition that had already been validated at every required level. Major Harlow finally lifted his gaze, observing her with a different understanding than before, no longer viewing her through the lens of local command authority, but through the confirmed framework that had been verified across external operational channels. The flag officer spoke once more, his tone calm and conclusive. All units will proceed under standard operational realignment procedures, he stated. The Marines acknowledged the directive in unison through subtle, synchronized adjustment, maintaining discipline while transitioning into the finalized command structure. Emily did not respond verbally, as none was required. The system itself had already registered her position, and the environment reflected that recognition in every aligned formation, every paused movement, and every controlled silence across Fort Redstone. The convoy vehicles at the perimeter remained stationary, their role in the transition complete, while the communications team continued final confirmation cycles to ensure stability across all networks. The yard, once defined by instruction and hierarchy, now functioned under a fully acknowledged structure that placed Emily Carter at its center, not through declaration, but through verified and complete operational recognition that extended across every level of command present.